I think that's a meme that won't die. You know, if you look at it, I mean, the president everyone is pretty much aware right now that the border can't be sealed. It can't be sealed for drugs. It can't be sealed for people. Are we actually expecting the border to be sealed for guns? And that number, you know, when you look at that number, that 90% of guns were confiscated in Mexico come from the United States. That number has a caveat, and the problem is that 90% of traceable guns that people get in Mexico are from the United States. But the number of guns overall that are not traceable is huge. So when you only take into account all guns and not only traceable guns, you see that only 17% of guns used in Mexico.
So you're saying there's a Mexican gun problem, but it's not all of American origin.
I would dispute that. I think that the statistics numbers are kind of overblown, or there's no real idea of how much is actually flowing across the border. I would say a lot of organizations that work specifically on weapons trafficking would say that there's been an increase in weapons that you can identify as coming from the United States, not produced here a lot, that are being imported from Europe, particularly the assault weapons that have the high caliber that Mexican drug traffickers like to use on a lot of things. I think there has been an increase in the flow. I think short, though, of the assault weapons ban, there's a lot that the administration could be doing on weapons, including more funding for the ATF, more investigation of licensed dealers that doesn't require legislative changes. And so there's a lot that could be done even in the legal framework that they're not doing, and I think that's probably where Mexico could push the U.S. government more on what they can do without reforming legislation.
Francisco, were criminals in Mexico carrying weaponry like this 10, 15, 20 years ago? Was it as awash in high caliber, fast rate of fire weapons as it is today?
The use of high caliber weaponry was not widespread back in the 80s or the 90s. Drug trafficking organizations have been in business, at least since the 1950s, 60s. Small outlets back then. Around the 1980s and early 90s, they started recruiting many people, deserters from the military, deserters from the federal, state, municipal police forces. And with this came also the exchange of weaponry. So the high caliber weaponry that you used to see in the 80s or 90s came actually from Mexican sources within the country. It had been stolen from the military. Since the 1990s, and particularly since the expiration of the ban on assault weapons in 2004, I would agree with Maureen that the evidence points to more widespread use of these types of weapons by the cartels in Mexico. And on the issue of the 90%, this number, which sometimes is used just to disqualify, say, well, given that it's 90% and that number is not correct, then that whole argument falls down. I would still say, even if weaponry is coming, as some people say, come from Venezuela, from Central America, remains from the 1980s dreadful civil wars, from China, from France, if 30 or 40% of the weaponry comes from the US, I still would say it's a very important aim to try to stop this type of trade. It's a bit like asking, people who are stranded in a boat and the boat is leaking through 4 holes. Oh, well, why try to plug in one? Well, maybe you could get 30 seconds extra or 1 more minute to try to do some other things. So I still think it's a laudable aim.
I think that any effort to constrain or to try to blockade the trade on guns is going to be as successful as any effort to constrain the trade on drugs.
But I think it's not just the trade. It's looking at the framework that you have existing and how do you increase. I mean, we're not talking about legislatively, let's legalize, drugs. I mean, the comparison in terms of the arms trafficking, there are a lot of things that could be done. Sharing information, there's amendments in Congress, the Tiahrt Amendment, that would help facilitate the patterns in terms of drug or arms sales in the United States that could help prosecution. There's a lot that could be done that would at least put more control over what's going on. I don't think anybody's really thinking that they're going to have this overhaul of all the Second Amendment or the Second Bill of Rights in terms of weapons, but I think there's a lot that could be done. And as Francisco said, it's in, I think, both countries' best interest to try to put a stop to some of this weapons and in the violence that's related to it.
Earlier this week, President Calderon went on national television and gave a full-length address to his people, sort of laying out the situation. And the United States came in for some attention during this speech. It was noted that It's like having a drug addict living next door in your neighborhood, which I thought was a very homey and easy to understand way of illustrating the situation. He called for suppression of use in the United States. We've been trying to suppress the use of drugs since the 1960s with the creation of what's now the drug czar. The first drug czar appointed by Richard Nixon in the late 60s. It hasn't worked. If Mexico is waiting for the United States to fix the problem by suppressing drug addiction, I'm not sure Mexico's got much of a chance of getting this problem solved. He also asked for help with the weapons. And, you know, it is a reminder. When you watched the speech to the Mexican people, it was a reminder of just how much of this is a Mexican problem, but a Mexican problem only made worse by the situation in the United States. Is that fair, Katie?
I would say absolutely so. President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton have both acknowledged that the U.S. consumption problem is the biggest challenge facing the Mexican drug war right now. And unless, you know, the political climate in Washington is willing to accept legalization as a viable alternative, I really don't see how we can move away from this militarization.
And Secretary Clinton, in that same speech, said, if you're thinking about legalization, forget it.
Right.
We're not thinking about it.
She basically laughed at the former presidents of Latin America, including President Zedillo, who recommended that we move toward a policy of legalization in the hemisphere as a whole, and who stated that the drug war is a failure.
Well, let's see if Secretary Clinton and the administration are going to be laughing after November when California is likely to pass a referendum legalizing marijuana. And then we will see some people getting nervous here in Washington, because what will be the reaction south of the border where thousands of people are dying every year trying to contain drugs coming into the United States. And then the largest state of the union says, you know what, we're going to legalize marijuana. Then that's going to change the relationship.
Be a challenge.
I think there are some really interesting debates going on in California and the state level here in terms of decriminalization or looking at alternative policies for drug consumption in the United States. The drug czar Kerlikowske is also kind of trying to get rid of the use of the war on drugs as a term. There's more money now on prevention and treatment, but I think even looking at Mexico, it's not that easy. And even if the United States could reduce significantly the consumers, there's always going to be a consumer population here. And as long as they're illegal or considered illegal, you're going to have this very lucrative market for drugs here and in Mexico, which actually has a much more higher number of consumers now than it did a few years ago. So I think this goes back to what else can Mexico be doing? What should Mexico be doing internally to address their security crisis, which is looking at improving their justice system, having better police that are able to do their job instead of having the military deployed on the streets. There's a lot of things addressing corruption that President Calderon really didn't talk about in his speech or in the statement over the weekend, of the infiltration of organized criminal groups into state structures. There's a lot that, beyond blaming the United States for a lot of what's going on, there's a lot of things that need to be done in Mexico that would certainly improve the situation.
Francisco, speak to that before we go to a break.
I think on the issue of legalization, I'd certainly say that those who push for it very strongly are not doing a great service to their cause, because they play into the hands of radicals. So, like some of my colleagues, whereas I agree that legalization is a long way off, maybe it will not happen, the issue of decriminalizing, and so not going after use or possession. The issue of, for example, California, the United States as a federal country where states are a laboratory of democracy, where we are a grown-up society, where this is a kind of issue that has to be debated in public, and where the public has had to give a democratic vote on which way they want to go to. War on drugs, 40 years, pretty much a failure. Let's go step by step. The decriminalizing in California, I think, is a step in the right direction.